The Blockade of Germany, 1939–1945, also known as the Economic War, involved operations carried out during World War II by the British Empire and by France in order to restrict the supplies of minerals, fuel, metals, food, and textiles needed by Nazi Germany, and later by Fascist Italy, in order to sustain their war efforts. The Economic War consisted mainly of a naval blockade which formed part of the wider Battle of the Atlantic, but also included the bombing of economically important targets and the preclusive buying of war materials from neutral countries in order to prevent their sale to the Axis powers. 1. The first period, from the beginning of European hostilities in September 1939 to the end of the Phoney War, saw both the Allies and the Axis powers intercepting neutral merchant ships to seize deliveries en route to their respective enemies. Naval blockade at this time proved less than effective because the Axis could get crucial materials from the Soviet Union until June 1941, while Berlin used harbors in Spain to import war materials into Germany. The second period began after the rapid Axis occupation of the majority of the European landmass, Scandinavia, Benelux, France, and the Balkans in 1940–1941, resulting in Axis control of major centers of industry and agriculture. The third period started in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service brought the U.S. officially into the European War. The final period came after the tide of war finally turned against the Axis after heavy military defeats up to and after D-Day in June 1944, which led to gradual Axis withdrawals from the occupied territories in the face of the overwhelming Allied military offensives. Historical background. At the beginning of the First World War in 1914, the United Kingdom used its powerful navy and its geographical location to dictate the movement of the world's commercial shipping. Britain dominated the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and due to its control of the Suez Canal with France, access into and out of the Indian Ocean for the Allied ships, while their enemies were forced to go around Africa. The Ministry of Blockade published a comprehensive list of items that neutral commercial ships were not to transport to the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. 1. This included food, weapons, gold and silver, flax, paper, silk, copra, minerals such as iron ore and animal hides used in the manufacture of shoes and boots. Because Britain and France together controlled 15 of the 20 refueling points along the main shipping routes, they were able to threaten those who refused to comply by the withdrawal of their bunker fuel control facilities. 3. In World War I, neutral ships were subject to being stopped to be searched for contraband. A large force known as the Dover Patrol patrolled at one end of the North Sea while another, the 10th Cruiser Squadron, waited at the other. The Mediterranean Sea was effectively blocked at both ends, and the dreadnought battleships of the Grand Fleet waited at Scapa Flow to sail out and meet any German offensive threat. Late in the war, a large minefield known as the Northern Barrage was deployed between the Faroes and the coast of Norway to further restrict German ship movements. 4. Britain considered naval blockade to be a completely legitimate method of war. 1. Having previously deployed the strategy in the early 19th century to prevent Napoleon's fleet from leaving its harbors to attempt an invasion of England, Napoleon had also blockaded Britain. Germany in particular was heavily reliant on a wide range of foreign imports and suffered very badly from the blockade. Its own substantial fleet of modern warships was hemmed into its bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven and mostly forbidden by the leadership from venturing out. 1. Germany carried out its own immensely effective counter-blockade during its war on Allied commerce, Handelskrieg, its U-boats sinking many Allied merchant ships. By 1917, this had almost swung the war the way of the Central Powers. 1. But because Britain found an answer in the convoy system, the sustained Allied blockade led to the collapse and eventual defeat of the German armed forces by late 1918. Build-up to World War II. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and following the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, and the later occupation of Czechoslovakia, many people began to believe that a new Great War was coming. 5. And from late 1937 onwards, Sir Frederick Leithross, the British government's chief economics advisor, began to urge senior government figures to put thought into a plan to revive the blockade so that the Royal Navy, still the world's most powerful navy, would be ready to begin stopping shipments to Germany immediately once war was declared. 3. Leithross had represented British interests abroad for many years, having embarked on a number of important overseas missions to countries including Italy, Germany, China, and Russia, experience which gave him a very useful worldwide political perspective. His plan was to revive the original World War I blockade, but to make it more streamlined, making better use of technology and Britain's vast overseas business and commercial network, so that contacts in key trading locations such as New York, Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo, Rome, or Buenos Aires could act as a vast information gathering system. Making use of tip-offs provided by a vast array of individuals such as bankers, merchant buyers, waterfront stevedores, and ship operators doing their patriotic duty, the Navy could have priceless advance knowledge of which ships might be carrying contraband long before they reached port. From left to right, Chamberlain, Daladier, Hitler, Mussolini, and Ciano pictured before signing the Munich Agreement, which gave the Sudetenland to Germany. Initially, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was not keen on the idea and still hoped to avoid war, but following his appeasement of Hitler at Munich in September 1938, which was widely seen as a stopgap measure to buy time, he too began to realize the need for urgent preparations for war. During the last 12 months of peace, Britain and France carried out a vigorous buildup of their armed forces and weapons production. The long-awaited Spitfire fighter began to enter service. The first of the new naval vessels ordered under the 1936 emergency program began to join the fleet, and the Air Ministry made the final touches to the chain-home early warning network of radio direction finding, later called radar stations, to bring it up to full operational readiness. A joint British-French staff paper on strategic policy issued in April 1939 recognized that, in the first phase of any war with Germany, economic warfare was likely to be the Allies' only effective offensive weapon. 6. The Royal Navy War Plans, delivered to the fleet in January 1939, set out 3 critical elements of a future war at sea. 7. The most fundamental consideration was the defense of trade in home waters and the Atlantic in order to maintain imports of the goods Britain needed for her own survival. Of secondary importance was the defense of trade in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. If Italy, as assumed, also declared war and became an aggressive opponent, her dominating geographical position might force shipping to go the long way around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa, but it was hoped to contain her with a strong fleet in the Mediterranean. Finally, there was the need for a vigorous blockade against Germany and Italy. Pre-war situation in Germany. In Germany, where Hitler had warned his generals and party leaders that there would eventually be another war as early as 1934, there was great concern about the potential effects of a new blockade. In order to force Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the original blockade was extended for an additional 9 months after the end of the fighting in October 1918. Citation needed this course of action, which Hitler called the greatest breach of faith of all time. 9 caused horrendous suffering among the German people, and according to some authors, led to an estimated 500,000 deaths from starvation. 10, 11, 12, Germany also lost its entire battle fleet of modern warships at the end of the war, and although new ships were being built as fast as was practical, the battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz had been launched but not yet completed. They were in no position to face the British and French navies on anything like equal terms. The Great Depression in an international perspective. Triangles mark points at which nations suspended gold convertibility and or devalued their currency against gold. Greatly deficient in natural resources, Germany's economy traditionally relied on importing raw materials to manufacture goods for re-export, and she developed a reputation for producing high-quality merchandise. By 1900, Germany had the biggest economy in Europe, and she entered the war in 1914 with plentiful reserves of gold and foreign currency and good credit ratings. But by the end of the war, though the UK also lost a quarter of its real wealth, 13, Germany was ruined, and she had since then experienced a number of severe financial problems. First, hyperinflation caused by the requirement to pay reparations for the war, then, after a brief period of relative prosperity in the mid-1920s under the Weimar Republic, the Great Depression, which followed the Wall Street crash of 1929, which in part led to the rise in political extremism across Europe and Hitler's seizure of power. Although Hitler was credited with lowering unemployment from 6 million, some sources claim the real figure was as high as 11 million, to virtually nil by conscription, and by launching enormous public works projects similar to Roosevelt's New Deal. As with the Autobahn construction, he had little interest in economics, and Germany's recovery was in fact achieved primarily by rearmament and other artificial means conducted by others. Because Germany was nowhere as wealthy in real terms as she had been a generation earlier, with very low reserves of foreign exchange and zero credit, 14, H. Jalmar Schacht and later Walther Funk, as Minister of Economy, used a number of financial devices, some very clever, to manipulate the currency and gear the German economy towards Wehrwirtschaft, war economy. One example was the MIFO bill, a kind of IOU produced by the Reichsbank to pay armaments manufacturers but which was also accepted by German banks. Because MIFO bills did not figure in government budgetary statements, they helped maintain the secret of rearmament and were, in Hitler's own words, merely a way of printing money. Citation needed. Schacht also proved adept at negotiating extremely profitable barter deals with many other nations, supplying German military expertise and equipment in return. The Nazi official who took the leading role in preparing German industry for war was Hermann Göring. In September 1936, he established the four-year plan, the purpose of which was to make Germany self-sufficient and impervious to blockade by 1940. Using his contacts and position, as well as bribes and secret deals, he established his own vast industrial empire, the Hermann Göring Works, to make steel from low-grade German iron ore, swallowing up small Ruhr companies and making himself immensely rich in the process. 15. The works were located in the area bounded by Hanover, Halle and Magdeburg, which was considered safe from land offensive operations. And a program was initiated to relocate existing crucial industries nearest the borders of Silesia, Ruhr and Saxony to the more secure central regions. The great Danube, Elbe, Rhine, Oder, Weser, Main and Neckar rivers were dredged and made fully navigable, and an intricate network of canals was built to interlink them and connect them to major cities. 16. While the armed forces were being built up, imports were reduced to the barest minimum required, severe price and wage controls were introduced, unions outlawed, and aware that certain commodities would be difficult to obtain once the blockade began. Deals were made with Sweden, Romania, Turkey, Spain, Finland and Yugoslavia to facilitate the stockpiling of vital materials such as tungsten, oil, nickel, wool and cotton that would be needed to supply the armed forces in wartime. Heavy investment was made in ersatz synthetic industries to produce goods from natural resources Germany did have, such as textiles made from cellulose, rubber and oil made from coal, sugar and ethyl alcohol from wood, and materials for the print industry produced from potato tops. There were also ersatz foodstuffs such as coffee made from chicory and beer from sugar beet. Germany also invested in foreign industries and agricultural schemes aimed at directly meeting their particular needs, such as a plan to grow more soya beans and sunflower instead of maize in Romania. 17. The American journalist William L. Shirer, who had lived in Berlin since 1934 and who made regular radio broadcasts to the U.S. for CBS, noted that there were all kinds of shortages even before the war began. 18. Germany produced 85% of its own food and UK 91%. Still, even after rationing, food portions were insufficient even for hard labor workers. On 24 August 1939, a week before the invasion of Poland which started the war, Germany announced rationing of food, coal, textiles and soap, and Shirer noted that it was this action above all which made the German people wake up to the reality that war was imminent. 18. They were allowed 1 bar of soap per month, and men had to make 1 tube of shaving foam last 5 months. Housewives soon spent hours standing in line for supplies. Shopkeepers sometimes opened otherwise non-perishable goods, such as tinned sardines, in front of customers when they were bought to prevent hoarding. The clothing allowance was so meager that for all practical purposes people had to make do with whatever clothing they already possessed until the war was over. Men were allowed 1 overcoat and 2 suits, 4 shirts and 6 pairs of socks, and had to prove that the old ones were worn out to get new. Some items shown on the coupons, such as bed sheets, blankets and table linen, could in reality only be obtained on production of a special license. Although the Nazi leadership maintained that the Allied strategy of blockade was illegal, they nevertheless prepared to counter it by all means necessary. In an ominous foreshadowing of the unrestricted submarine warfare to come, the Kriegsmarine Navy sent out battle instructions in May 1939 which included the ominous phrase, "Fighting methods will never fail to be employed merely because some international regulations are opposed to them." 7. First phase. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. September 2017, learn how and when to remove this message. Hitler invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, and Britain and France declared war 2 days later. Within hours, the British liner Athenia was torpedoed by U-30 off the Hebrides with the loss of 112 lives, leading the Royal Navy to assume that unrestricted U-boat warfare had begun. Although France, unlike Britain, was largely self-sufficient in food and needed to import few foodstuffs, she still required extensive overseas imports of weapons and raw materials for her war effort, and there was close cooperation between the two allies. As in World War I, a combined war council was formed to agree strategy and policy, and just as the British Expeditionary Force, which was quickly mobilized and sent to France, was placed under overall French authority, so various components of the French Navy were placed under Admiralty control. In Britain, it was widely believed that the bombing of big cities and massive civilian casualties would commence immediately after the declaration. In 1932, the MP Stanley Baldwin made a famous speech in which he said that the bomber will always get through. This message sank deeply into the nation's subconsciousness, but when attacks did not come immediately, hundreds of thousands of evacuees gradually began to make their way home over the next few months. Scapa Flow was again selected as the main British naval base because of its great distance from German airfields. However, the defenses built up during World War I had fallen into disrepair. During an early visit to the base, Churchill was unimpressed with the levels of protection against air and submarine attack, and was astounded to see the flagship HMS Nelson putting to sea with no destroyer escort because there were none to spare. Efforts began to repair the peacetime neglect, but it was too late to prevent a U-boat creeping into the flow during the night of 14 October and sinking the veteran battleship Royal Oak with over 800 fatalities. 1939 cruises. Admiral Graf Spee. Deutschland. Although U-boats were the main threat, there was also the threat posed by surface raiders to consider. The 3 pocket battleships which Germany was allowed to build under the Versailles Treaty had been designed and built specifically with attacks on ocean commerce in mind. Their strong armor, 11-inch guns and 26-knot 48 km/h speed enabled them to outmatch any British cruiser, and 2 of them, the Admiral Graf Spee and the Deutschland, had sailed between 21 and 24 August and were now loose on the high seas, having evaded the Northern Patrol, the Navy squadron that patrolled between Scotland and Iceland. The Deutschland remained off Greenland waiting for merchant vessels to attack, while the Graf Spee rapidly traveled south across the equator and soon began sinking British merchant ships in the southern Atlantic. Because the German fleet had insufficient capital ships to mount a traditional line of battle, the British and French were able to disperse their own fleets to form hunting groups to track down and sink German commerce raiders. But the hunt for the 2 raiders was to tie down no less than 23 important ships along with auxiliary craft and additional heavy ships to protect convoys. Citation needed. At the start of the war, a large proportion of the German merchant fleet was at sea, and around 30% sought shelter in neutral harbors where they could not be attacked, such as in Spain, Mexico, South America, the United States, Portuguese East Africa, and Japan. Citation needed. 28 German bauxite ships were holed up in Trieste, and while a few passenger liners such as the New York, St. Louis, and Bremen managed to creep home, many ended up stranded with goods deteriorating or rotting in their holds and with Allied ships waiting to capture or sink them immediately if they tried to leave port. The Germans tried various ways of avoiding the loss of the ships, such as disguising themselves as neutral vessels or selling their ships to foreign flags, but international law did not allow such transactions in wartime. Citation needed. Up to Christmas 1939, at least 19 German merchant ships were scuttled by their crews to prevent them from being taken by the Allies. 20. The pocket battleship Graf Spee herself was scuttled outside Montevideo, Uruguay, where she sought repairs to damage sustained during the Battle of the River Plate after the British spread false rumors of the arrival of a vast naval force tasked to sink her, an early success for the Royal Navy. Contraband control. The day after the declaration, the British Admiralty announced that all merchant vessels were now liable to examination by the Naval Contraband Control Service and by the French Blockade Ministry, which put its ships under British command. 21. Because of the terrible suffering and starvation caused by the original use of the strategy, a formal declaration of blockade was deliberately not made. 22. But the communiqué listed the types of contraband of war that was liable for confiscation if carried. It included all kinds of foodstuffs, animal feed, forage, and clothing, and articles and materials used in their production. This was known as conditional contraband of war. In addition, there was absolute contraband, which constituted all ammunition, explosives, chemicals, or appliances suitable for use in chemical warfare, fuel of all kinds, and all contrivances for means of transportation on land, in water, or the air, all means of communication, tools, implements, and instruments necessary for carrying on hostile operations. Coin bullion, currency, and evidences of debt. The Royal Navy selected 3 locations on home soil for contraband control: Weymouth and the Downs in the south to cover the English Channel approaches, and Kirkwall and Orkney to cover the North Sea. If ships were on government charter or sailing directly to Allied ports to unload cargo or passengers, they would not be detained any longer than was necessary to determine their identity. But if on other routes they were to stop at the designated contraband control ports for detailed examination. Ships proceeding eastward through the English Channel with the intention of passing the Downs, if not calling at any other channel port, should call at Weymouth for contraband control examination. 23 ships bound for European ports or en route to the north of Scotland should call at Kirkwall. 3 further British contraband inspection facilities were established at Gibraltar to control access into and out of the western Mediterranean, Haifa at the other end of the Mediterranean in northern Palestine, and Aden on the Indian Ocean coast of Yemen at the southern entrance to the Red Sea to control access into the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal. To patrol the Mediterranean and the Red Sea access to the Indian Ocean, Britain would work together with the French, whose own navy was the world's 4th largest, and comprised a good number of modern, powerful vessels with others nearing completion. It was agreed that the French would hold the western Mediterranean basin via Marseille and its base at Mers el-Khaber, Oran on the coast of Algeria, while the British would hold the eastern basin via its base at Alexandria. The Allies had practical control over the Suez Canal, which provided passage between the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean via Port Said at the northern entry to the canal. The canal, built largely by French capital, at that time came under British jurisdiction as a result of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. Contraband control at sea. The whaler from HMS Sheffield, with a boarding party of 12 men armed with revolvers, is lowered prior to inspecting a merchant ship. The party would check the ship's papers and navigation certificate to ensure that it was not engaged in supplying the enemy. The work of the actual inspection of cargoes was carried out by customs officers and Royal Naval officers and men who, together with their ships, were assigned to contraband control for various periods of duty. The job of control officer required great tact in the face of irate and defiant neutral skippers, particularly Dutch and Scandinavians who had a long tradition of trade with Germany. Contraband control patrols dotted all practical sea routes, stopping all neutral ships and making life very difficult for any who tried to slip by, forcing them into ports and laying them up for days before inspection, in some cases ruining perishable goods. Control ports were often very overcrowded, teleprinters constantly sending out cargo listings and manifests to be checked against import quota lists. Even for innocent ships, a delay of a day or two was inevitable. Contraband control officers were under instructions to be extremely polite and apologetic to all concerned. Neutral captains often expressed utter astonishment and bemusement at the level of British advance knowledge of their activities, and soon realized it was hard to hide anything. Although numerous attempts were made to bypass the blockade, the net was extremely hard to avoid, and most neutral captains voluntarily stopped at one of the 8 Allied contraband control ports. 24. Ministry of Economic Warfare. The job of coordinating the various agencies involved in the blockade was carried out by the Ministry of Economic Warfare (MU), which in the last few weeks before the outbreak of war had been set up by Frederick Leithross. Leithross had not been put off by Chamberlain's initially lukewarm reception to his plan to revive the blockade, but had in fact spent the time after Munich to continue his preparations regardless. Leithross recruited shrewd bankers, statisticians, economists and experts in international law, and an army of over 400 administrative workers and civil servants for his new ministry. 3. It was their job to compile and sift through the raw intelligence being received from the various overseas and other contacts, to cross-reference it with the known data on ship movements and cargoes, and to pass on any relevant information to contraband control. They also put together the statutory list, sometimes known as the blacklist, of companies known to regularly trade with, or who were directly financed by Germany. In mid-September, the ministry published a list of 278 pro-German persons and companies throughout the world with whom British merchants and shipowners were forbidden to do business, subject to heavy penalties. When shipments from these companies were detected, they were usually made a priority for interception. One lesson that was learnt from World War I was that although the Navy could stop ships on the open seas, little could be done about traders who acted as the middleman, importing materials the Nazis needed into their own neutral country, then transporting it overland to Germany for a profit. 25. Leith. Ross spent the months before the war compiling a massive dossier on the annual quantities of materials the countries bordering Germany normally imported, so that if they exceeded these levels in wartime, pressure could be brought on the authorities in those countries to take action. Diplomats from the Scandinavian nations, as well as Italy and the Balkan countries, who were also major suppliers to Germany, were given quota lists of various commodities and told they could import these amounts and no more or action would be taken against them. A ship stopping at a control port raised a red and white flag with a blue border to signify that it was awaiting examination. At night, the port authorities used signal lights to warn a skipper he must halt, and the flag had to stay raised until the ship was passed. Arrangements for boarding and examining ships were made in the port boarding room, and eventually a team of 2 officers and 6 men set out in a fishing drifter or motor launch to the ship. After apologizing to the captain for the trouble, they inspected the ship's papers, manifest, and bills of lading. At the same time, the wireless cabin was sealed so no signals could be sent out while the ship was in the controlled zone. After satisfying themselves that the cargo corresponded with the written records, the party returned ashore and a summary of the manifest, passengers, ports of origin and destination was sent by teleprinter to the ministry, when the ministry's consent was received. The ship's papers were returned to the captain along with a certificate of naval clearance and a number of special flags, one for each day, signifying that they had already been checked and could pass.